Emily had been traveling for hours, and as her taxi finally pulled up to the hotel, she felt an odd sense of relief. The city was bustling with activity, but the hotel was tucked away on a quiet street, almost hidden from the world. The neon sign above the door flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow. She was a bit tired to be picky, so when the driver mentioned this hotel, which offered a bargain rate, she decided to give it a shot. The lobby inside was old-fashioned, dark velvet carpets, brass chandeliers, and faded portraits hanging on the walls. It looked like something out of a movie set from the 70s. The receptionist, a man in his late 50s, greeted her with a tight-lipped smile. His thin, graying hair matched the dusty air in the lobby. "Checking in?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Just one night," she replied. "I have a meeting tomorrow, so I just need a place to sleep for the night." The receptionist handed her a brass key with the number 13 on it, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. It was odd how cold his hand was. He smiled again, but this time it seemed forced. "Room 13. It's at the end of the hall on the 3rd floor. It's one of our older rooms," he said, trailing off, almost as if he was warning her. "Thanks," Emily replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping into her thoughts. The elevator creaked as it made its way to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dimly lit, with flickering lights overhead that created long shadows along the walls. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, the carpet beneath her feet worn and threadbare. When she reached room 13, Emily hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was small, furnished with antique pieces, a dark wooden bed frame, an old dresser, and a moth-eaten armchair. The walls were painted a faded shade of blue, and the window was half covered with worn curtains, blocking out most of the light. As she unpacked her bag, Emily felt a strange chill in the room, despite the warmth of the outside air. The bed looked inviting, but something about the space unsettled her. The mirror on the far wall reflected the room, but something about the reflection seemed off. For a brief moment, it almost felt as though there was a figure standing behind her, just out of sight. She turned around quickly. Nothing was there. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the feeling of paranoia. She sat on the bed and turned on the TV, trying to distract herself. The room was so silent that it felt almost oppressive. Around midnight, she was jolted awake by the sound of faint footsteps in the hallway outside. They were slow, deliberate, almost as though someone was pacing back and forth. Emily sat up, her heart beginning to race. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, but when she got up and peeked out the door, the hallway was completely empty. Confused and a little frightened, she returned to the bed, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly, and she could see her breath in the air. She pulled the covers up around her shoulders, but sleep was elusive. Then there was a soft tapping on the door. It was faint at first, then louder. Tap, tap, tap. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the tapping, growing louder and faster. The door swung open, and Emily froze. Standing in the doorway was a tall, shadowy figure. It was hard to make out its features, but it had a dark, indistinct shape. It stepped forward, and Emily could feel the air grow heavier, as if it were pressing against her chest. Before she could scream, the figure was gone. The door slammed shut on its own, and the room returned to an unnatural silence. Emily didn't know what to do. She wanted to leave, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her, watching her. She grabbed her things and ran downstairs. The receptionist was sitting at the desk, eyes wide open, staring blankly at a book in his hands. He didn't even look up as she approached. "Excuse me, I need to check out," she said, her voice shaky. He nodded, as if he had been expecting her. He handed her the bill without a word. "Room 13 has that effect on people," he said quietly, finally meeting her eyes. "I suggest you leave now before the night gets any worse." Emily didn't ask what he meant. She grabbed her things and left, her mind racing. As she stepped outside, she noticed a small plaque on the side of the hotel. It read, "Established in 1921, Room 13, no vacancy." The year caught her attention. The hotel had been in operation for decades, but something about Room 13 felt different. Something older, more sinister. She would never return to that hotel, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened in that room had followed her, lingering in the shadows just out of sight. Mike had been on the road for days. After a long stretch of travel through California, he was exhausted and desperate for a cheap place to stay. He found an odd hostel on the outskirts of Los Angeles, tucked away behind a narrow alley. The neon sign above the door was flickering, and the building looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. At first glance, the place looked abandoned, but Mike was too tired to be picky. The front door creaked open as he entered. Inside, the hostel felt frozen in time, as if it had been stuck in the 80s. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The receptionist, an elderly woman with wild white hair and glasses that seemed too large for her face, greeted him with a strange, almost knowing smile. Her eyes were clouded, like she hadn't slept in days. "Looking for a bed?" she asked in a raspy voice. "Yeah," Mike replied, glancing around nervously. "Just for one night." She handed him a key, its brass number 17, glinting in the dim light. "Room 17, up the stairs," she said, her voice trailing off. Mike nodded and made his way up the creaky stairs. As he walked down the hallway, a strange chill ran down his spine. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs, some of them so cracked they barely resembled people anymore. The lights above him flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to follow his every move. He found room 17 at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was sparse with just a bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto the empty street below. A large mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed. The bed itself was made neatly, the sheets white and crisp. Mike set his bag on the desk and sat down on the bed. He was too tired to care about the strange atmosphere in the room. But as he lay back, he felt something wasn't quite right. The air was thick, suffocating. He glanced around the room, but everything appeared normal. It wasn't until he turned off the light and closed his eyes that he noticed it. The soft whispers coming from somewhere just outside the door. At first they were faint, like voices carried on the wind, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. Mike sat up, heart racing. The voices were coming from the hallway. He quickly got out of bed and opened the door. The corridor was empty, not a soul in sight. But as he stood there, he noticed something strange. The air felt colder, and there, in the reflection of the hallway mirror, he saw something move. It was fleeting, just a shadow, but it was enough to send a chill through his bones. "Just my mind playing tricks," he whispered to himself. He closed the door and locked it, but the whispers only grew louder, now accompanied by faint footsteps that seemed to circle around the room. The walls creaked, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of something unseen. The temperature in the room dropped rapidly, and Mike could see his breath. Panic set in. He tried to open the window, but the glass wouldn't budge. Then the whispers stopped. Everything went silent. The room felt empty. The oppressive coldness vanished. The floor no longer creaked. Mike's breath slowed, and he cautiously stepped back from the door. The key was still in his hand. The receptionist had mentioned something about the hostel being special. Mike didn't care. He wanted out, and he wasn't going to wait around to find out what was wrong with room 17. He left the room and ran down the stairs, only to find the receptionist staring at him with a smile that seemed far too wide. "You didn't see him, did you?" she asked. Mike didn't respond. He left the hostel without looking back, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what happened, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been in that hostel wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Something far darker had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to notice. John and Sarah had been on the road for days, the endless stretch of Route 95, seeming like an endless loop. They'd been driving for hours, the desolate landscape stretching before them, and fatigue weighed heavily on them both. When the sign for Motel Reality appeared on the horizon, they sighed in relief. It was the only place for miles. The motel was old, with peeling yellow paint and dim streetlights casting eerie shadows on the parking lot. There were a few cars, but the place had an unsettling quiet. They stepped inside, greeted by stale air. Behind the desk stood a frail, older man with deep lines etched into his face. His gaze lingered longer than it should have as he handed John a key with a brass tag marked 6. "Room 6, it's the only one left," the man murmured, almost as if he were warning them. John gave Sarah a side glance, but they were too tired to argue. They headed to the room in silence, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Room 6 was small. The walls were a faded yellow, and the bed was covered with a threadbare blanket. The air was musty, like the room hadn't been aired in years. A dresser and an old chair sat by the window. But what caught Sarah's attention most was the large, ornate mirror on the wall opposite the bed. Its dark, twisted frame seemed to writhe under the dim light. John tossed his bag on the bed, trying to ignore the discomfort. "It's not much, but it'll do. Let's sleep." But Sarah's eyes were fixed on the mirror, her face uneasy. "Something's not right here," she whispered. John waved it off, exhausted. "It's just an old motel. Let's rest." As night fell, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Sarah's breath became visible in the air, and she pulled the blanket tighter. The room felt colder than it should. Then faintly, she heard it, a whisper, barely audible, like a voice carried by the wind. "John, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. John, still half asleep, frowned. "What?" The whispering grew louder, then clearer, like multiple voices murmuring in the distance. Sarah's heart raced. "John, it's coming from inside the room." John stood up and opened the door to the hallway, but the corridor was empty, the air thick with stillness. He stepped back inside, but the whispers hadn't stopped. In fact, they seemed to grow louder. The bed creaked as though something were moving beneath it. John checked, but there was nothing. The floorboards groaned, and Sarah's eyes locked onto the mirror. It had changed. The reflection in the glass was darker. The walls seemed to close in, and the bed in the reflection was covered in dark, ominous stains. Shadowy figures appeared, their hollow eyes staring back at them. "What the hell?" John muttered, stepping back. Sarah gasped, her face pale. "They're coming closer," in the mirror. Figures were moving toward them in the glass, their hands reaching out, trying to break through. Sarah backed away, but it was as if the mirror was pulling her in, drawing her toward it. Panic surged through her. "We need to leave," John shouted, grabbing her arm. They ran to the door, but as John turned the handle, the room seemed to shift. The floor trembled, and the walls bent inward, closing around them. A deep hum resonated through the air, vibrating in their bones. The room was warping, as if reality itself was distorting. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the door. Tap, 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 tap. John swung it open, but there was no one in the hallway. The air felt wrong, thick with an oppressive weight. He stepped outside, but everything was still, as if time had frozen. When he returned, the room had changed again. The shadows in the corners had lengthened and stretched, and the mirror had begun to glow faintly, showing a reflection that no longer matched the real room. A tall figure stood in the doorway. It was impossibly tall, its body a deep void, devoid of features. Its presence filled the room with suffocating darkness. John's breath caught in his chest, and before he could react, the figure stepped forward. John and Sarah froze, unable to breathe, paralyzed by the figure's presence. Its black silhouette seemed to absorb all light around it, making the room darker. They backed away, but the figure moved closer, its form towering over them. Time seemed to slow as the figure advanced. The room around them felt even colder, and their vision blurred. They couldn't escape. Then everything went black.